Imagine walking into a world where the line between the sacred and the forbidden was so thin that even the gods were believed to cross it. A world where rituals carried whispers of obsession, jealousy, resurrection, and terrifying punishments for breaking ancient taboos. Tonight we open the sealed doors of ancient Egypt, not the golden temples or the royal tombs, but the dark chambers historians rarely talk about. Because some secrets were buried for a reason. Ancient Egyptian mythology hides some of the most unsettling and symbolic stories ever recorded. Tales that mix divine power with taboo acts meant to explain creation, vengeance, and cosmic balance. These myths weren't entertainment, they were spiritual blueprints, believed to shape the laws of the world itself. When the gods behaved in ways that felt violent, obsessive, or morally disturbing, the Egyptians didn't see it as depravity. They saw it as the terrifying price of maintaining order over chaos. And some of those divine stories influenced real rituals, shaping how priests, pharaohs, and entire temples behaved behind closed doors. The most haunting example begins with the god Osiris, whose murder by his own brother Set became the foundation of Egyptian religion. According to ancient beliefs, Isis, Osiris's wife, was so desperate to bring him back that she reassembled his scattered body parts and used magic to conceive a child with him after death. This myth, both sacred and unsettling, became a symbol of resurrection, but also revealed a darker truth in Egypt. Divine power wasn't gentle. It demanded acts that blurred the line between devotion and obsession. Priests reenacted this myth through rituals that were deeply symbolic, but carried eerie undertones, especially during temple festivals where they believed the gods relived the creation cycle through performers, statues, and sacred ceremonies. These weren't tales kept in scrolls. They were breathed into life through rites only the highest-ranking priests could witness. Another disturbing tale involved Set, the god of storms and violence, who committed acts intended to humiliate and dominate Osiris's son, Horus. The myth wasn't meant to be read literally but symbolically, reflecting the eternal clash between order and chaos. Yet its implications were so unsettling that later Egyptian scribes softened parts of the story, and archaeologists found evidence that priests interpreted these events through rituals intended to cleanse the world of Set's influence. These myths shaped how Egyptians viewed purity, power, and authority. The pharaoh, believed to be the living Horus, was expected to symbolically defeat Set repeatedly, ensuring the world didn't fall into spiritual darkness. Even in royal courts, decisions about succession, marriage, and divine legitimacy were influenced by these stories, creating a political environment built on fear of cosmic imbalance. And deep within temple walls, some rituals reenacted the triumph of one god over another, using symbolic actions that ordinary people were never allowed to witness. These divine stories were considered too sacred, too powerful, and too unsettling for the public eye. The Egyptians believed that by hiding these myths, they were protecting the spiritual stability of their kingdom. But the secrecy also gave these tales an eerie energy, like a warning from the ancient world about how easily divine power could twist into something terrifying. It's in these forgotten myths, carved into crumbling temple walls and buried beneath the sands, that we find the foundation for some of the most disturbing beliefs that shaped ancient Egyptian society. Ritual purity in ancient Egypt wasn't just a religious requirement. It was a weapon, a form of control, and a spiritual threat that followed people anywhere they went. The Egyptians believed that unseen forces constantly tried to contaminate the body, the spirit, and even the spaces people walked through. To them, impurity wasn't dirt, it was danger, it was chaos, it was a stain that could invite misfortune, curses, or the wrath of the gods. And because of that belief, purification became something far darker than bathing or cleansing. It was a discipline enforced with fear, secrecy, and rituals that pushed the limits of the human body and mind. Priests lived under the most extreme rules. Their daily lives revolved around a set of taboos that demanded absolute control over their behavior. They shaved their entire bodies every 2 or 3 days so that no stray hair would offend the gods. They slept on simple mats, avoided certain foods, and were required to wash themselves repeatedly, from sunrise to sunset, using water blessed by temple officials. But purification wasn't only about physical cleanliness. It demanded emotional and spiritual silence. A single moment of uncontrolled emotion could be interpreted as weakness, an opening where chaotic spirits might slip in. Priests were required to detach themselves from desire, anger, grief, and fear, forcing them to exist almost like living statues. If a priest broke these rules, even by accident, he wasn't gently corrected. He was removed from sacred duty, and sometimes punished with intense public rituals meant to drive out the impurity inside him. These ceremonies could involve long hours of chanting, isolation in dark temple chambers, or standing beneath cold water poured over the body until the spirit was considered cleansed. Ordinary Egyptians faced their own terrifying purity laws. Entering a temple required strict preparation. Anyone who had experienced a moment of deep emotional turmoil, grief, or anything considered spiritually heavy, was forbidden from entering sacred spaces for days. Some people believed that spirits clung to the skin during moments of weakness, so they stayed away from holy places out of fear of triggering divine anger. Women were subject to even stricter rules during certain phases of their lives, not because of discrimination, but because the Egyptians believed powerful energies moved through the body during those times, energies that could disrupt the spiritual balance of a temple. Instead of being cared for, many were isolated from rituals, creating a sense of shame and fear around natural cycles they couldn't control. In royal courts, purity became political. Advisors could accuse rivals of being spiritually unclean, using temple laws to remove them from power. A single accusation could result in public cleansing rites that damaged reputations or ended careers. Even pharaohs weren't immune. Before entering certain temples, they were required to undergo purification routines that stripped them of their royal comfort and forced them to follow procedures designed to remind them that even kings could be spiritually fragile. Egyptians believed that impurity attracted chaos, and chaos attracted disaster, illness, misfortune, famine. And even the anger of the Nile was sometimes blamed on a failure to maintain these strict rules. So purity wasn't about faith alone. It was survival. It was protection from forces they believed were always watching, always waiting for a moment of spiritual weakness to strike. Royal blood in ancient Egypt wasn't just a symbol of power. It was treated as a substance filled with divine energy, something fragile, dangerous, and too sacred to be mixed with ordinary flesh. The Egyptians believed their rulers were living gods, the physical descendants of Horus, and because of that belief, maintaining a pure bloodline became an obsession that shaped the most secretive and unsettling customs inside the palace. Marriage wasn't about affection or choice. It was strategy, fear, and spiritual duty twisted together. Advisors and priests believed that if royal blood spread too far outside the family, the pharaoh's connection to the gods would weaken, and chaos would seep into the kingdom. So unions were arranged with absolute rigidity, creating an environment where individuals had little say in their own futures. Children born into the royal household grew up with the heavy weight of expectation. Their lives were mapped out before they could even speak. Every friendship, every lesson, every gesture was monitored by palace officials who needed to ensure the future king or queen remained spiritually and politically intact. They were told that their blood was not only sacred but vulnerable, and that the slightest disobedience could disrupt the cosmic balance. The corridors of the palace were filled with whispers. Alliances were fragile, jealousy simmered beneath the surface, and every decision, even who sat next to whom during ceremonies, was analyzed for its impact on the divine lineage. One wrong move could spark rumors that a prince or princess was spiritually unfit, a phrase that carried the weight of exile, disgrace, or permanent removal from public life. Behind closed doors, the pressure on heirs was immense. They were expected to embody perfection, not just physically, but morally and spiritually. A moment of rebellion was considered a threat to the entire kingdom. Tutors disciplined young royals with strict routines that micromanaged their speech, posture, diet, and emotional expression. Even their dreams were monitored, interpreted by court priests who believed messages from the gods could reveal weaknesses or divine warnings. Pharaohs themselves were trapped by the expectations of purity. Publicly, they were seen as invincible, chosen by the gods to guide the nation. Privately, they were constantly tested, examined, and evaluated by high priests who feared the consequences of a spiritually weakened king. A pharaoh who failed to meet divine standards could be pressured into rituals designed to strengthen his purity, some involving long periods of isolation or symbolic acts meant to reaffirm his connection to the gods. Succession battles became a shadowy battlefield where purity was both a weapon and a shield. Rivals accused one another of being born under ill omens, or of having a flawed lineage that could defile the throne. These accusations weren't taken lightly. They triggered investigations led by temple officials who wielded enormous power, capable of declaring someone unfit based on symbolic interpretations alone. The pursuit of purity shaped royal life from birth to death. It dictated marriages, ceremonies, punishments, and even how rulers were remembered after they were gone. Royal tombs emphasized lineage with meticulous carvings that reminded future generations of the divine blood that once flowed through the veins of their kings and queens, reinforcing the fragile and fear-filled system that held the ancient monarchy together. Magic in ancient Egypt was not a superstition. It was a force as real and feared as death itself. The Egyptians believed that words, symbols, and rituals could bend fate, summon protection, or bring ruin to an enemy. Among the most unsettling uses of this power were spells designed to manipulate desire, obsession, and emotional control. These weren't romantic or harmless charms. They were acts meant to dominate the heart and mind of another person, and the ingredients used to cast them reveal a darker side of ancient belief. Love spells were often born from desperation, jealousy, or heartbreak. A person who felt rejected could seek out a magician or priest skilled in Hika, the sacred science of magic, and ask for a ritual that would force someone to return their affection. The magician would then guide them through steps that blended prayer with practices that carried a chilling undertone. Some spells required the caster to visit tombs at night, because the Egyptians believed spirits wandering the necropolis had the power to influence human emotions. The caster might whisper their target's name into the darkness, calling on restless souls to deliver the message directly to the person's heart. The ingredients used in these spells were equally disturbing. Wax figures were commonly shaped to resemble the intended person, and these figures were heated, melted, or pierced while the magician chanted incantations demanding obedience. In some rituals, objects that symbolized desire or dominance were burned, with the rising smoke meant to carry the spell upward to the gods, forcing them to intervene. More intense rituals required materials associated with death, ashes from old offerings, dirt gathered from tomb entrances, or fragments of broken funerary objects, thought to hold lingering spiritual energy. The Egyptians believed that mixing these with oils or wine created potions capable of influencing the mind, making the target restless until they submitted to the will of the spellcaster. Not all magic targeted affection. Some rituals were designed to separate couples, using symbols of decay, destruction, and spiritual rot to break emotional bonds. These spells were often commissioned in secret by people who stood to benefit politically, romantically, or financially. A broken relationship could shift alliances, alter inheritance, or weaken a rival's emotional stability, making separation magic a powerful weapon in both private lives and court politics. Magicians who performed these rituals lived on the edge of fear and respect. Their knowledge gave them influence, but it also marked them as dangerous. Many operated in silence, performing rituals in hidden chambers or isolated sections of temples, where ordinary people were not allowed. They believed the gods listened closely to emotional manipulation magic, and that one mispronounced word could summon unintended forces with unpredictable consequences. Even after a spell was cast, the Egyptians feared lingering effects. Some people wore protective amulets or carried papyrus scrolls with counter-spells designed to repel unwanted influences. The belief that someone could seize control of your emotions through supernatural means created an atmosphere of suspicion, especially among the elite where power and relationships were intertwined. These rituals show how deeply the Egyptians believed in the invisible threads connecting people. Threads they thought could be pulled, twisted, or severed through magic that blurred the boundary between love and domination, desire and fear, human will and divine intervention. The ancient Egyptians believed death was not an end but a transition, a passage into a realm where the soul continued living, feeling, wanting, and experiencing the world in ways that mirrored life. Because of this belief, they feared that if certain parts of a person were not restored or protected, the spirit would enter the afterlife incomplete. Desire, identity, and emotional connection were seen as essential parts of the human experience. And the Egyptians were convinced these did not disappear with the final breath. This belief led to funerary rituals that focused not only on preserving the body, but on restoring aspects of the self tied to vitality, emotion, and personal power. The body was treated as a sacred vessel that needed every part, every symbol, every feature returned to its ideal form. If anything was missing, the spirit would suffer in the next world. Priests took this responsibility seriously, and some restoration practices carried eerie undertones. They worked in silence inside cold embalming chambers, following ancient scrolls that outlined which symbols to draw, which amulets to place, and which rituals to perform to ensure the dead could feel, speak, and act in the afterlife. Many believed the dead retained desires, not in a physical sense, but as expressions of identity and personal completeness. This belief influenced specific rites that were meant to energize the ka, the life force, and reconnect it with the preserved body. Some procedures were symbolic reenactments of creation myths, meant to ignite the soul with the spark of divine power. Rituals like the opening of the mouth ceremony held immense importance. Priests touched sacred tools to the lips, eyes, and chest of the mummy, believing this act restored the ability to eat, breathe, speak, and feel once the spirit crossed into the afterlife. Each gesture was deliberate, a reenactment of the gods restoring life itself. This ceremony wasn't simply about practical survival, it was about returning the essence of humanity. Without it, the Egyptians feared the soul would wander in darkness, trapped in silence, and unable to reunite with loved ones. Tomb workers carved scenes on walls that showed the deceased enjoying banquets, embracing family, and participating in the pleasures of eternity. These images weren't decorative. They were magical blueprints, thought to guide the spirit into a world where they could continue relationships, desires, and emotional bonds. The Egyptians believed strongly in the continuation of companionship and connection, and they prepared their dead accordingly. Families placed personal items inside the tombs: jewelry, clothing, tools, perfumes, objects meant to awaken memories and ensure the spirit felt whole. Some burials included letters written by grieving spouses or children, messages meant to travel with the dead. These letters begged for comfort, forgiveness, or protection from the other side, reflecting the belief that emotional ties could pass through the veil separating life from death. Even food offerings were chosen carefully. Certain spices, oils, and breads were believed to energize the spirit, filling it with warmth and vitality in the next world. The Egyptians feared a cold, hungry afterlife as much as they feared death itself. Their dedication to preserving desires and emotional fullness in eternity reveals a culture obsessed with continuity, terrified of spiritual decay, and determined to make sure that no soul entered the afterlife incomplete.